Salle Church in Norfolk is one of the finest 15th century buildings in England. It was paid for by a group of wealthy landowners who'd made their money in the wool trade and was constructed in the first half of the 15th century. This is the Great West Door, the ceremonial door of the church. All the timber you see with that wonderful arcading is original. To left and right of it are angels censing to give honour to anyone going in or out of the church, whilst above it a series of shields show us the coats of arms of the many benefactors of this church. The angels have wonderful feathered legs. Here we're in the Great North Porch, where not only religious activities took place but secular ones too. You see the benches on either side of the porch, just there so that witnesses to transactions could sit. The door itself is medieval, with the same design of tracery that we saw on the Great West Door. And above us, the Lierne vaulted ceiling has some remarkable carved bosses. Just look at this closing ring on the door and think that probably 20 or 23 generations of Salle villagers have grabbed hold of this handle to give access to the room above. Our first view inside the west door is of the font with its enormous wooden cover suspended from a wooden crane. The cover could be lifted up when the font was in use. This is one of a series of about 30 seven-sacrament fonts in England. Each side is carved with a depiction of one of the sacraments, and this one is of baptism. Most seven-sacrament fonts are octagonal, which give the sculptor an extra side, the eighth side, for a subject of his choice. And in this particular font, it is of the crucifixion. We know a lot about this font because it bears an inscription on its base. Around the base of this font is an inscription in Latin recording the names of the donors, John and Agnes Luce. They gave this not only as a gift to the church, but to ensure that people would remember them and pray for their souls in the afterlife. Salle Church has porches on both the north and the south side, and this little door behind me leads to a room over the porch, which can show us clues as to what it was originally for. You can see by these many bosses on the ceiling that this was a high status room. And down here in the east wall is the remains of a piscina for a priest to wash his fingers before Mass. And so we know that this room was designed to be a chapel. The bosses are inspired by both biblical and secular scenes. Here is a famous image of a green man. And here a musical angel. These were painted in the 1930s by Professor Tristram, one of the country's leading experts on medieval wall paintings. Towards the end of the Middle Ages, many churches of this size procured pulpits, and the one behind me is a very good example. It's a wine glass pulpit, which means it stands on a single stem. Here's the colouring. Red and green were the two basic colours in medieval churches, and you can see where the tracery has been picked out in colour on this side, but lost on that, showing a ghost of the pattern that was originally there. All medieval churches were divided by a wooden screen, known as the rood screen, dividing the nave, the part of the church where most of the secular activities took place, from the chancel, the Holy of Holies. Unfortunately, as with many of these screens, only the base now survives, the top having been lost at the Reformation. But this one still has remains of its original colour scheme and its wonderful traceried spandrels. Here on the base of the screen we have the remains of the paintings of two of the doctors of the church, St. Augustine and St. Jerome, easily picked out by his cardinal's hat here. Just as in the pulpit, we have the alternating backgrounds of green and red, but in addition we have some inscriptions on this rood screen. Just here on the top rail we can see some lettering, and this is a little bit of the creed. When we come round to the panels themselves, you'll see that the spandrels of the arches are carved with mythical heraldic features. So here we have a lion and an eagle, and on the other side a man on horseback, probably St. George, and a dragon. It would be wrong to think that everything in a medieval church was Gothic. Here we have some wonderful naturalistic carvings and paintings on the muntins of the rood screen, showing that, in fact, everything in this church was beautifully coloured and decorated to show the glory of God. Backing onto the rood screen are what is known as return stalls. These seats, together with another dozen on each side, were used by clergy during the medieval liturgy. There were never enough clergy to fill them all. They were actually a status symbol, copying from the nearby monasteries, of which Norfolk has so many. Each seat has a tip-up base with naturalistic carvings on them, known as misericords. Here we have foliage and a lion's head. And although we're miles from the sea, here is a pair of fish. The seats are raised off the floor level, and you can see to left and right of me these lovely quatrefoiled openings. And these are here to provide a form of amplification for the voices that were being used in this part of the church. Many of these have been found to have large vases, terracotta vases behind them, which act as amplification, and we call these sound holes. Here on the south side of the altar is a piscina, where the priest would have washed his fingers before Mass. You see the drain hole in the bottom. But this delightful top is carved not just with foliage, but with lovely heads, and once again, in the centre, a nice lion. Having moved from the chancel, to north and south of the nave are transepts. Although today they are the repository for memorials, they were established as private chapels for individuals or for craft guilds. And in this north transept, another piscina, and this time, recently uncovered, you can see the tracery decoration that was originally over the top of the carved arch, and it retains much of its original paint. The central gangway was one of the most important places to be buried in the Middle Ages. And I want you to look at a brass of a former priest of this church. This is the brass of Simon Boleyn, a member of the family of Anne Boleyn, large Norfolk farmers. And it shows you not only an inscription to him, but also where a chalice used to stand above his inscription. These are a peculiarity of this part of England, and over 30 have been recorded. Here's one with the chalice intact. From the south aisle, we can see the differing roof structures. The aisle on our left has a flat lean-to roof, whilst in the nave is a much taller arch-braced roof. It retains much of its original colouring, with the sacred monogram, angels and donors' heads. But most remarkable of all are the bosses in the chancel roof, showing the adoration of the Magi, Christ's entry into Jerusalem, and finally the Last Supper, still with traces of their medieval paint. Above the chancel arch is a horizontal beam just below the window, which formed a cellule, a canopy of honour to the rood screen and loft beneath it. At the bottom of the picture you can see two corbels. Those supported the rood beam itself, on which would have been the statues of the crucified Christ, Our Lady and St. John. And the carving, the cellule above, gave honour to that set. It might appear that there's very little stained glass in this church. Indeed, it is a very light building. But in the tracery of the east window behind me, you can see some fragments of medieval glass. And there's much more to be studied in this church. Here in the tracery, we see two abbesses. That on the right, certainly St. Etheldreda, founder of the monastery at Ely that became Ely Cathedral. And in this window, we see one of the orders of angels. This order is known as Powers. All the glass in the church was made in Norwich, a great centre of medieval manufacture. Whilst here are patriarchs. Don't you just love those cardinals' red hats? Salle Church is built of limestone. Norfolk has no decent building stone, so all the dressed stone to make the corners, the buttresses, the pinnacles, the battlements has been brought in from Barnack in Cambridgeshire, which is 100 miles away. It would have travelled here by water and then a short distance overland to this site. In between the dressed stonework, we use the local flint, but it's covered over with lime wash, which is a protection against the elements. The dressed stone from Barnack is ideal for carving. We've already seen some bosses inside the church, but here on the outside we find graffiti as well. Here is a musical notation on the south buttress of the chancel. Here we can see the contrast between the limestone from Barnack in Cambridgeshire and the rougher flint of which the majority of the church is built. Salle Church is a testament to those who thought in the long term. Whilst it was built over only a few decades, it was intended to be here forever.